International Space Station, or ISS, has been swinging above humanity's collective heads for almost 3 decades. But it won't be up there forever. Details are still a little vague, but we're all going to have to say goodbye to the ISS sometime around 2030. Personally, I will be buying a fifth of bourbon and trying not to cry as the remnants of its metallic corpse crash into Earth's spaceship graveyard in the South Pacific. But if the bourbon can't console me, I can always think of all the weird things the ISS taught us about reality. It turns out a lot of things don't work the same up there as they do on Earth. From human cells to spiders to, goodness gracious, small balls of fire. Because safety first, people. So let's break down 5 of the weirdest discoveries we've made thanks to the ISS. Scientists have a particular interest in knowing what kinds of life can and can't survive outer space environments. Horror movies are, sadly, not a reliable source. For example, they might focus entirely on the lack of air or the extreme temperatures, and not at all on the cancer-causing radiation that isn't getting blocked. If humanity ever wants to try setting up a colony somewhere as inhospitable as Mars, let alone terraforming it, we're gonna need to know where to start. Which kinds of life will have the best chance of survival to help give us the best chance? Well, in a study published in 2025, one research team attempted to answer this question by slapping a bunch of moss to the outside of the ISS. I'm only kind of exaggerating. The team chose the species Physcomitrium patens, which is a cute little kind of palm tree looking plant that is used quite a bit for scientific experiments. It's physiologically simple, we've sequenced its full genome, it's known to be pretty dang good at dealing with environmental stress. What's not to like? The team also chose to investigate 3 different forms of the moss, representing 3 different life stages. First, there's protonemata, which are chains of cells from very early in the reproductive process. Then brood cells, which act like spores. And finally, sporophytes, reproductive structures that basically give birth to the spores. All of these mossy cells were placed in a small box-like container with a mesh window for exposure, and attached to a special platform outside the station's module called Kibo. Not with a spacewalk, but with the space station's robot arm. Then they were left out in space for 9 months. Different samples were subjected to different aspects of a standard space environment, like the general vacuum of it all, the extreme heat and cold, and perhaps most damaging of all, ultraviolet radiation. And while neither the protonemata nor the brood cells survived the full experiment, a significant number of the sporophytes did. A full 99% survived the vacuum of space, 81% survived the freezing cold, 36% survived the high heat, and 27% survived the ultra-damaging UVC rays. You can't even get UVC rays down on Earth's surface. They're the ones our atmosphere blocks out, which is why your sunscreen only worries about the A and B types. But that's not all. After the surviving sporophytes were brought back to Earth, 80% of the spores cocooned inside them germinated. Not only did they lived enough to carry on a new generation. Now, granted, even multiple generations of moss aren't the most complex life forms in the world. They're not even the most complex plants we've brought to space. In fact, humanity's done a lot of research on plants in space. It's mostly crop plants, because if you ever intend to live anywhere other than Earth or take really long space journeys, we'll need crops to feed ourselves. But because of their simplicity, mosses can help scientists set a solid baseline for how plants in general may fare in a spaceship's tiny garden, or on the surface of another planet. Certain mosses are also quite hardy here on Earth, so they have the potential to survive in more hostile environments than complex plants like crops and trees. So if we can't get a crop growing on our first fancy lunar research base, we can at least ship some moss up to help make oxygen. But even if we never wind up colonizing the solar system, this research isn't useless. Testing plants' hardiness in space can help researchers figure out how resistant they can be to the effects of climate change on Earth, which you may have noticed has become a bit of a problem. So wherever future humans have to live, today's space moss can teach us how to survive whatever tomorrow's deal is. Unless tomorrow reveals we're living in a horror movie and the monster is space-mutated moss. Stem cells are the building blocks and maintenance crews of almost all our tissue. Not only are they great at making more of themselves, but they basically start as blank slates. Then when given the right chemical signal, bam! They transform into a new, more specialized type of cell. If scientists can harness that power for medical treatments, say to regrow a patient's damaged organ, we can have an absolute game changer on our hands. Now, the stem cells inside of you right now aren't as blank slatey as you'd find in a newborn baby. After all, the latter ones just got done cooking, metaphorically speaking. For example, a newborn's cardiovascular progenitor cells, or CPCs, can create a greater variety of cardiovascular cells than adult CPCs. But what if we could convince those adult CPCs to dream bigger? Not necessarily all the way to true blank slates you'd find in embryos, which have to build a body from scratch, but at least regain the options of a newborn CPCs. Space could help with that. According to a paper published in 2021, if you bring adult CPCs to the ISS and let them chill in microgravity for a month, they will change to resemble something closer to that newborn state. Thanks to all kinds of pathways for chemical reactions and signals opening up, the cells got even better at replicating themselves and differentiating into other cardiovascular tissues. One might say the stem cells got even stemmier. Now, do we know for sure why this happened? Unfortunately, no. Scientists have a few ideas, and they observed some related genes getting turned on and off, but there's no concrete answer yet. We also don't know how to replicate this on Earth, to bring about a revolution in stem cell treatments. But maybe if scientists can figure out what exactly makes those genes flip on and off, they could make progress on growing replacement organs from cell cultures. After all, it'd be great to circumvent the crucial but frustrating bottleneck that is organ donation. If this study is the first step, we'll be on a path to sci-fi space organ replacements in no time. Now, just like the ISS, SciShow needs funding to keep running, so here's a quick ad.
If you're watching this, you're probably the kind of person who loves engaging with new ideas and learning outside of a classroom. That's what we offer at SciShow, and it's what Brilliant offers too. You can enjoy all the good edutainment that you get from watching videos like SciShow, plus a more interactive platform in Brilliant. Brilliant is made for everyone from age 10 to 110. Brilliant helps you build skills and improve confidence in coding through courses like Thinking in Python. To learn for free on Brilliant for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/SciShow, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant.
You've probably heard of the three main states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. You're also likely heard of a fourth state, plasma, the sun kind, not the blood kind. But scientists have identified way more states than four, including Bose-Einstein condensates, or BECs. A BEC emerges when some gas gets so cold, the weirdness of quantum physics starts playing out on macroscopic scales. What do I mean by that? Well, in quantum physics, each particle has its own quantum state, which has nothing to do with the states of matter. Basically, a particle's quantum state is a complex math equation that describes everything about that particle, like its position and its spin. Meanwhile, all particles of the same type, such as every single electron, are interchangeable with one another. So if you collect a bunch of the same particles that are also sharing the same state, they'll wind up amplifying the quantum behaviors of just one of them. In a BEC, instead of thousands of separate atoms, they all collectively act like one large atom. And scientists can use them to observe some weird fundamentals of reality, like how each bit of matter is both a particle and a wave. But creating and maintaining a BEC is easier said than done. For one thing, when I said cold, I meant hovering just above absolute zero, which is tricky to achieve on Earth. For another, after you've got your BEC, one standard experiment requires you to then monitor its particles during free fall. And when you're in a lab on Earth, you've got like 1 second of observation time, max. Lucky for scientists, the ISS has the Cold Atom Lab on board, which solves both those problems. The Cold Atom Lab is sometimes called the coldest spot in the universe, and it's a multi-step process to get it that way. It starts with laser cooling, trapping atoms in the middle of 6 lasers until they stop vibrating so much. It's kind of like how if you push a kid on a swing at the wrong time, they'll slow down instead of picking up speed. Then the lab switches off the lasers and turns on a magnetic trap to hold the newly chilled atoms, which is carefully tuned to allow the hottest of those uber cold atoms to evaporate away. Finally, it turns down the intensity of the magnetic trap and allows the atoms to spread out and get even colder. In the microgravity environment of the ISS, scientists can push this further than they can on Earth. They can cool things down to less than 1/1000th of 1 Kelvin, all from the remote comfort of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. Meanwhile, microgravity also helps the atoms to stay in free fall longer, giving scientists much more time to study their behavior. We don't just want to study BECs to better understand quantum shenanigans, of course. There are potential practical applications too, like inside superconductors that transmit electricity without energy loss, or the lasers and atomic clocks that keep everything from the clocks on your phones to GPS working properly. But for even more shenanigans, let's move on to our next subject of scientific investigation: spiders. You may personally have issues with spiders, but I think they're cool even when they aren't giving teenagers superpowers. And just like Spider-Man in 1972's Marvel Team-Up number 54, several real spiders have been launched into space. Technically, the bad guys were trying to launch the Hulk into space, and Spidey was just there to stop them. Don't worry, he got rescued eventually. For a long time, scientists have known that spiders decide how to orient their webs using gravity. But they wanted to test if gravity was the only guide they used. Hence, the sending of spiders to a space station, which, much like studying a BEC, is easier said than done. The first spider astronauts arrived at NASA's Skylab station back in 1973, but someone forgot to pack any food for the spiders, so the human astronauts couldn't tell if the weirdly shaped webs were because the spiders were in microgravity or just starving. Researchers tried again in 2008, bringing 2 spiders to the ISS. The experiment featured 1 adult spider and a juvenile backup, along with colonies of fruit flies for them to munch on. Unfortunately, the backup spider somehow escaped its cell and joined the first spider, so no one could tell whose web was whose. Not that it even mattered, because the fruit flies end up reproducing so fast, the sheer mass of them blocked the view inside the cell. But finally, in 2011, scientists got their spider experiment to work. They took 2 golden silk orb weavers to the ISS, leaving 2 more on Earth as controls. The species they picked is known for making asymmetric webs, which would make it easier to notice any differences in orientation. By the way, the astronauts who took care of the 2 spiders nicknamed them Esmeralda and Gladys. The experiment setup was improved to avoid both cross-contamination and fruit fly overload. And after a 2-month observation period and 56 space-based webs, the team learned that in the absence of gravity, spiders will use light to orient both their webs and themselves. The spiders seem to treat the direction of light as up and the other as down, implying they instinctively knew that light meant up. While it might sound weird for spiders to have a plan B for when gravity seemingly disappears, remember that bodies are fallible, be they human or spider bodies. It makes sense they evolved another system that can take over if the gravity-sensing one fails, or to work in tandem for extra support. However, a whopping 2 spacefaring spiders is a pretty small sample size. We'll need a lot more if we want to make certain that this is a real thing, and not just an Esmeralda and Gladys thing. To be fair, pretty much everything acts weird in microgravity, including fire, which apparently burns cold. In a 2012 experiment called Flex, astronauts set small droplets of heptane fuel on fire and let them burn themselves out. The goal was to better understand how to extinguish fires, and they chose heptane because 1, it's relatively simple, 2, it's very well studied, and 3, at least for a while, scientists thought it may have been a good ingredient in some kind of substitute or surrogate, to use the technical jargon, for gas or diesel fuel. How this work will transfer to other fuels, we don't know, but you gotta start somewhere. During the experiment, the crew saw the burn and then saw the extinction. But their instruments revealed there was an invisible flame that kept going until it finally snuffed itself out. Turns out, the camera was capturing a kind of burning known as cool flame chemical heat release, which isn't really that cool from a human perspective. A cool flame burns around 600 degrees Celsius, but that's nowhere near the roughly 2,000 degrees you can measure in a flame burning your typical hydrocarbon fuel. Under ideal conditions, at least. While scientists knew heptane could produce a cool flame before the much hotter visible flame, getting one after was a complete shock. This sparked a whole bunch of excitement around space-based cool flames. And in 2021, researchers were able to get a gas-fueled cold flame to burn in space for the first time. One day, cold flame research could lead to more efficient and less polluting engines, turning the same amount of fuel into more power. And of course, understanding how fuel is secretly burning will keep astronauts safer, as fires can get very dangerous very quickly in the tight quarters of a space station floating in an empty sea of death. With so much weird and wonderful science coming from the ISS, it's a bummer that we have to say goodbye to it in a few years. But there's still plenty of time for scientists to make even weirder discoveries.